I held the words behind my teeth so long they started to feel like something living, not a thought anymore, not an idea I could set down and walk away from, a weight that shifted when I breathed, that pressed harder whenever someone spoke with certainty, whenever voices around me filled the air like smoke and left no room for doubt. It wasn't fear the way people like to describe it later, clean and simple, a single emotion with a name. It was layered. It was the cold understanding of what happens to a person who interrupts the wrong kind of confidence. It was the knowledge that some rooms do not allow warnings, only agreement, that there are moments when silence is not the absence of sound, but an act, deliberate, chosen, practiced. I remember how my mouth would go dry at the smallest opening, a pause in conversation, a question that wasn't really a question, just an invitation for someone to confirm what had already been decided. Those gaps felt like doors left ajar. I could see through them, into the place where the truth waited, and I would almost step through. The warning rose in me in pieces, not as a speech, but as fragments. A detail that didn't fit, a pattern I'd seen before, the faint stink of something wrong beneath the clean surface of plans and promises. It made my stomach tighten the way it does before you fall from a height, not the fall itself, but the moment you realize there is nothing to catch you. I told myself to be sure. I told myself not to be dramatic. I told myself that I didn't know what I thought I knew, that there were reasons I couldn't see, that someone else, someone louder, someone with the right to interrupt, would say it if it mattered. That was the first lie I learned to tell myself that responsibility belongs to whoever speaks the most. The second lie was softer, easier to swallow. It sounded like discipline. It sounded like loyalty. It sounded like being sensible in a world that punished the wrong kind of honesty. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over people when they want to believe something will work, because it has to. It's not hope. It's not courage. It's a collective refusal to look directly at the edge of the. You can feel it in the way eyes slide away from certain details, in the way questions die half-formed, in the way laughter comes too fast, too forced, as if noise alone can keep reality from stepping closer. In that quiet, my warning felt indecent. It felt like an interruption of a ritual, like spilling ink across a document already signed, like bringing a candle into a place where everyone had agreed the darkness was preferable. I could picture the faces if I spoke. Not anger, not at first. Something worse. The slow turn of attention. The brief, uncomfortable recognition that I had introduced uncertainty into a machine built to crush it. I could imagine the silence that would follow my words, how it would not be empty but full of calculation, full of questions no one would ask aloud. Who is he to say this? Why now? What is he trying to protect? And beneath all of it, the unspoken verdict. He is making trouble. Trouble was a kind of betrayal. I learned to listen for that word even when nobody said it. It hid in the tightening of shoulders, the narrowing of eyes, the way voices could remain polite while something colder moved underneath. There were consequences that didn't need to be announced. You could feel them approaching like weather. So I rehearsed silence the way others rehearsed certainty. I sat with my hands still, so no one would notice the tremor. I kept my expression neutral, so no one would ask what I was thinking. I trained myself to nod at the right moments, to let other people's confidence wash over me, to pretend that the pounding in my chest was only the strain of long days and not the panic of watching a door close. Because that was what it felt like. A door, swinging inward, slowly, inevitably. And with every second I waited, it became harder to speak. Not because the warning changed, but because the moment to give it kept moving farther away, like a shore as the tide pulls back. I told myself I would speak when I had the perfect words, when I had proof, when I could say it without sounding afraid. But the truth is, I was always afraid. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of being right, afraid of the attention that comes with breaking the spell. And somewhere between one breath and the next, I understood that I wasn't waiting for the right moment at all. I was waiting for the moment to pass. So when the room finally went quiet in that particular way, when the air held its breath, when everything hovered just before becoming irreversible, I kept my mouth closed like I had already decided. The place had its own kind of weather, even when the sky outside did. Inside, the air stayed the same. Stale warmth trapped in fabric and paper and old sweat, the faint bite of metal in the back of the throat, the constant smell of bodies packed too close for too long. It wasn't just a room, it was a system, a living thing made of routines and signals and unspoken rules that were followed more faithfully than any written order. You learned quickly what belonged where. Boots lined a certain way without anyone telling you. Cigarettes offered and refused in the same rhythm every day. Voices lowered when a particular step entered the corridor. Not because anyone had to say be quiet, but because the building itself seemed to lean toward that sound. The way a dog lifts its head when it hears the right car door. It was never one man alone who held authority. It was the idea of him, carried through everyone who moved when he moved, spoke when he spoke, laughed when he laughed. Authority spread like a shadow that didn't need a body to cast it. You could feel it in your posture before you even saw who was coming. And you learned, fast, what questions cost. Not openly. No one kept a ledger. No one announced punishments like in stories. It was subtler than that, which made it more effective. A look that stayed a moment too long. A task you didn't get assigned again. A conversation that died when you entered. A favor that used to come easily, suddenly unavailable. You could lose warmth without anyone admitting they'd withdrawn it. You could become invisible in a place where invisibility was a kind of danger. The chain of command wasn't just a ladder, it was a wall. It separated those who could decide from those who could only carry decisions out, and it made sure nobody forgot which side they lived on. Up there, plans arrived polished, already shaped into inevitability. Down where I stood, you didn't see the whole picture, and that was always the explanation. You don't have the full context. You're not in a position to know. It's been considered. Those phrases were said with the calm of people repeating prayers, not angry, not even defensive, just certain in the way certainty is taught. As if the act of questioning itself was childish, like interrupting an adult conversation with a worry you should have outgrown. And I had watched what happened to men who didn't outgrow it. There was one who spoke too plainly too often. Not a troublemaker in the usual sense. No shouting, no refusal, no open defiance. Just a man who asked for numbers twice. Who pointed at a line on a map and said, "That doesn't make sense." Who asked why a thing that failed last time was being tried again without any changes. He didn't get dragged away. He didn't vanish in the night. He stayed. That was the lesson. He stayed and became an example. He was moved, quietly, into the kind of work where his questions couldn't echo. His name stopped being used in the rooms where decisions were shaped. People stopped turning their heads when he spoke. And eventually, he stopped speaking at all. It happened so gradually you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening, which was the point. The system didn't have to break you. It only had to show you, gently, what it could take away. So men like me learned to keep our thoughts behind our eyes. We learned to swallow reactions before they reached our faces. We learned that the safest way to survive proximity to power was to seem uncomplicated, because complexity looked like doubt, and doubt looked like disloyalty. Days fell into patterns. The same papers arriving, the same hands passing them along. Messages sent, messages received, shoes scuffing the same floors, chalk dust on fingers, coffee gone cold, someone always coughing, someone always clearing his throat, as if trying to dislodge something stuck deep inside. There were moments of quiet that weren't peace. Quiet used for listening. Listening to the building breathe, listening for footsteps, listening for the change in tone that meant you were expected somewhere. Then there were the planning moments. The ones that pulled men into a tighter circle. A table, a map, a series of statements that sounded like conclusions more than discussions. The language of inevitability. We will. We must. It cannot be otherwise. Nobody said, "I'm not sure." Not out loud. The higher you stood, the more certainty became part of your uniform. It didn't matter if that certainty was real. It mattered that you wore it without seams showing. The confidence had to appear seamless, or the whole structure looked fragile. And fragility was a threat. I wasn't a strategist. I wasn't a man whose signature moved lives like pieces across paper. I was close enough to see what was being built, but not close enough to touch it. Close enough to hear the tone in which decisions were spoken, the softness of certain assumptions, the speed with which inconvenient details were brushed aside. Close enough to feel, in my bones, when the room wanted agreement more than accuracy. That closeness was its own danger, because when you are near the center, you start to hear the parts that don't match. You start to notice when confidence is being used to cover a gap. You start to see how often "it will be fine" is spoken not because anyone knows, but because everyone needs it to be true. There were nights when the building emptied and the silence became honest. The kind of silence where you could hear paper settling, a distant door closing, the small sigh of a lamp as it cooled. Those nights were the worst, because without the noise of routine, your mind filled in what routine kept at bay. I'd sit with my hands on a file that wasn't mine to change and feel something in me tightening, as if my body understood what my mouth refused to admit. Sometimes I would catch someone else's eyes across the room, only for a second, never long enough to be called a shared understanding. But it was there, a flicker of recognition. Everyone knew. You could tell by the way a man adjusted his collar when a certain detail was as if suddenly uncomfortable in his own skin. You could tell by the way jokes stopped short. By the way, a voice would grow slightly louder when someone was covering fear with volume. By the way, men found reasons to step out of the room when a particular part of the plan was discussed. Those weren't acts of ignorance, they were acts of self-protection. Because knowledge without permission is a liability, and permission wasn't granted to the lower rungs. It was implied that the higher levels had already accounted for everything. That if something seemed wrong, it was because you couldn't see the angle that made it right. The structure depended on that belief the way a bridge depends on its supports. If the men below stopped believing the men above, everything became open, unstable. And instability in wartime had its own consequences that were used like a ghost story told to keep children from wandering too far. We'd all seen what disruption could, not just to the person who spoke, but to everyone around him. We'd all felt the pressure to be useful, to be reliable, to not become the reason someone's attention shifted from the enemy to the inside of the room. So the safest thing was to be quiet, to blend in, to keep your hands busy and your expression calm, to act as if you didn't notice the flaw being carried forward like a sacred object. And when the day came that the men with the power gathered closer, voices lowered, the map laid out like a verdict, I stood where I always stood, close enough to hear, far enough to be ignored, and I understood, with a sick clarity, that the place wasn't built to receive warnings. It was built to absorb them, to swallow them whole, to make the one who carried the warning feel smaller with every second he held it. And in that environment, silence wasn't just common, it was trained into you. It was expected. It was the cost of staying where you were. So I watched the routines continue, watched certainty harden, watched the room move toward a decision as if pulled by gravity, and I kept my thoughts locked behind my teeth, because I already knew what speaking up would make me. There is a particular cruelty in almost speaking. Not the silence itself, but the moment just before it. The breath drawn in, the muscles tightening, the thought arranging itself into something that could be understood by another human being. That moment happened to me again and again. Like a reflex my body couldn't unlearn even when my mind begged it to stop. I would feel it before I recognized it, a pressure in my chest, a warmth in my face, the sense that my mouth was about to betray me by opening on its own. And then I would clamp down on it, hard, as if restraint were a physical act I could perform with enough force to erase what I knew. I argued with myself constantly, but never out loud. I told myself that doubt was not knowledge, that suspicion was not proof, that intuition, no matter how sharp it felt, was still only a feeling. I told myself that there were men whose entire lives had prepared them to decide these things, and that I was not one of them, that my role was to observe, to execute, to trust. Trust became my favorite word to hide behind. It sounded honorable. It sounded clean. It allowed me to pretend that silence was a virtue instead of a failure. When my thoughts grew loud, when the warning pressed against my ribs like it wanted out, I would tell myself that trust meant letting go of the need to that trust meant discipline, that trust meant survival. But there were moments when that story cracked. They came at inconvenient times, when someone asked an innocent question that brushed too close to the problem, when a detail was mentioned casually that confirmed what I feared, when a laugh landed wrong because it came too early. In those moments, my thoughts sharpened into words whether I wanted them to or not. I would rehearse them silently. Not speeches, just a sentence. A simple interruption. Something small enough not to sound dramatic. We might want to reconsider this. There's a risk we're overlooking. This assumes things will go a certain way. Each version felt inadequate the moment I imagined saying it. Too weak to matter, yet strong enough to mark me. I could already hear the response. Not hostile, not loud, just patient. That's already been addressed. You're missing the larger picture. We don't have time for hypotheticals. The imagined conversation always ended the same way, with me standing there, exposed, having achieved nothing except the clear demonstration that I didn't belong at the center of certainty. Sometimes I would go further in my head. I would imagine pushing past the first dismissal, speaking again, insisting, watching faces change as my persistence turned from curiosity into irritation. In those imaginings, I never became persuasive. I never became respected. I became tolerated at best, isolated at worst. The outcome shifted in details, but never in direction, and I would feel a kind of relief when I let the fantasy collapse. Because if speaking wouldn't change anything, then silence felt justified. That was another lie I leaned on heavily. That effectiveness determined responsibility. If my words wouldn't stop what was coming, then why pay the price of saying them? Fear wore many disguises, but that one was my favorite. There were times I told myself that I was protecting others by staying quiet, that speaking up would only spread uncertainty downward, create hesitation where hesitation could be dangerous, that my doubt, once voiced, would ripple through people who trusted the structure more than they trusted themselves. I imagined confusion multiplying, orders second-guessed, timing, slipping, and all of it traced back to me, the man who couldn't keep his concerns to himself. In that version of events, silence became an act of care. I told myself that stability mattered more than my discomfort, that collective confidence was fragile and should not be disturbed by one person's unease, that whatever went wrong would go wrong regardless of my input. But then there were the quieter moments, when those arguments lost their edge. Late at night, when I lay awake staring at nothing, the warning came back stripped of all the justifications I'd dressed it in. It returned as something simpler and harder to avoid. This will not end the way they think it will. I couldn't always articulate why. Sometimes it was a pattern repeating itself. Sometimes it was a number that didn't align with experience. Sometimes it was the speed with which confidence arrived, as if urgency itself had been mistaken for clarity. Whatever the reason, the conclusion felt steady, and that steadiness frightened me more than uncertainty, because steady doubt is harder to dismiss. I would replay past moments when I'd been wrong, holding them up like evidence against myself. I reminded myself of times when things had worked out despite my misgivings. I cataloged every instance where authority had proven wiser than I'd assumed. But I also remembered the opposite. I remembered the quiet disasters, the ones that didn't explode immediately, the ones that unfolded slowly enough for everyone to pretend they weren't happening until it was too late to intervene. I remembered the men who'd said afterward, in low voices, that they'd felt it coming, felt it, but hadn't said it. That memory scared me because it made me recognizable to me. There were moments when the temptation to speak became physical. My heart would beat faster when certain assumptions were repeated, as if my body were trying to alert me to danger, even when my mind tried to stay obedient. My jaw would ache from holding tension. My hands would curl, nails pressing into my palms. Once, I opened my mouth. Nothing dramatic. No interruption. Just the beginning of a sound, a breath shaped toward language. Someone else spoke at the same time, louder, more assured, carrying the conversation forward like a current. The moment passed. No one noticed my near failure. I felt a rush of relief so intense it made me lightheaded. And underneath it, something darker. Shame. Because a part of me had wanted to be interrupted. Wanted an excuse not to continue. Wanted someone else to take responsibility for my silence. I started to understand that the struggle wasn't really between obedience and conscience. It was between action and consequence. Between the abstract idea of doing the right thing and the very real, immediate cost of being the one who disrupted the order everyone depended on. Every day I delayed, silence became easier. Not lighter, but more familiar. It settled into me like a second skin. The warning didn't disappear, but it learned to stay quiet unless provoked. I could function. I could listen. I could do my work without flinching every time the subject came up. That scared me too, because it meant I was adapting. And adaptation in that environment was indistinguishable from acceptance. I began to measure time differently, not in days or hours, but in opportunities lost. Each meeting ended without my voice becoming another small death. Each plan moved forward without interruption, and with it, the sense that the moment to speak was receding, becoming less appropriate, more disruptive. Soon it felt absurd to imagine speaking at all. Why now? I would ask myself. Why bring this up so late? The longer I waited, the more my silence seemed to validate what was happening. It became evidence that there was nothing worth saying, that, more than fear, kept me quiet. Because speaking late doesn't feel like courage, it feels like guilt trying to save itself. And so the conflict remained unresolved, looping endlessly inside me. The warning stayed alive, but contained. My conscience paced behind my restraint like an animal behind a fence, visible, restless, but trapped. I still believed the outcome would be wrong. I still believed someone should say something. I just no longer believed that someone was me. And as that belief settled in, heavy and final, I felt the silence deepen, not as an absence, but as a choice I was already practicing, whether I admitted it or not. The moment did not announce itself. There was no sharp turn, no sudden hush that told everyone something irreversible was about to happen. It arrived the way these things always do, wearing the face of routine, dressed in familiarity, moving forward on the strength of momentum alone. People gathered, papers were arranged, the table filled with the quiet authority of presence. Voices settled into the register they used when decisions were no longer being explored, only affirmed. It was a tone I recognized instantly, the sound of a path being locked in place. I stood where I was meant to stand, close enough to hear every word, far enough to be unnecessary. The flawed assumption surfaced early, almost casually. It was not framed as an assumption at all, but as a foundation, something already agreed upon, already absorbed into the structure of what followed. It was stated once, then echoed indirectly, its logic woven into everything that came after it. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. A tightening behind my eyes, a shallow breath, the familiar pressure in my chest, as if something inside me were pushing upward, demanding relief. I felt the warning surge again, not as fear, not as panic, but as clarity. This is where it breaks. The realization landed with a strange calm, not relief, not certainty, just the steady knowledge that the thing I had been circling was now directly in front of me, no longer theoretical, no longer waiting. Someone asked a confirming question, not a challenge, just enough to give the appearance of deliberation. The answer came quickly, too quickly. It smoothed over the inconsistency with confidence, dismissing complexity in favor of decisiveness. Heads nodded, pens moved. The assumption hardened, turning from something spoken into something official. I felt heat rise in my face. My hands had gone numb. I flexed my fingers without realizing it, the movement small, almost invisible, as if even my body understood it had to remain discreet. I swallowed, aware of how loud the sound felt inside my own skull. This was it. Not the last chance. There had been others, but the final one that mattered. If I spoke now, it would not be a suggestion. It would be a disruption. It would slow things down. It would force reconsideration. It would expose uncertainty where certainty was required. And it would put a name on the doubt. Mine. I imagined the room reacting, not dramatically, not with outrage, but with that subtle shift I had learned to fear. The pause that would follow my words. The recalibration. The way attention would narrow. Not on the issue, but on me. I could see myself in their eyes before it happened. The man who complicated things at the worst possible moment. The man who introduced risk by naming it. The man whose voice did not belong. My heart beat harder, faster. Each pulse felt like a countdown. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the weight of my tongue resting uselessly in my mouth, of how much effort it was taking to remain still. Someone else spoke, building on the assumption, layering confidence on top of confidence. The plan took shape, no longer fragile, no longer tentative. It began to feel solid, inevitable, real. I opened my mouth. For a fraction of a second, the warning reached my lips fully formed, not rehearsed, not softened, clear enough to matter. Then I saw it. Not a look, nothing so obvious. A posture, a subtle lean forward, the unspoken signal that the room was moving on, that the time for uncertainty had closed, that whatever was about to be said needed to align or be crushed by the forward motion. I hesitated, and in that hesitation, my body made the decision my mind had been avoiding. My jaw tightened. The words dissolved before they could leave. I closed my mouth. The physical sensation of that choice surprised me. It wasn't neutral. It wasn't passive. It felt like swallowing something sharp, like forcing a stone down my throat and pretending it belonged there. The moment passed. The conversation flowed around the absence of my voice as if it had never been an option. The decision continued to assemble itself piece by piece, unchallenged, reinforced by repetition and agreement. What could have been a fracture sealed over smoothly. No one noticed. That was the most unsettling part. No one looked at me expectantly. No one waited for my input. No one sensed the weight of what hadn't been said. The system absorbed my silence effortlessly, the way it had been designed to. I stood there, present and irrelevant, feeling the warning settle back into me like something buried alive. As the final affirmation was given, as the language shifted from possibility to commitment, I felt a strange detachment take hold. Not numbness, something colder. The awareness that a line had been crossed, not outwardly, but inwardly. I had not been overruled. I had not been ignored. I had removed myself. The meeting ended the way such meetings always do. Chairs moved, papers gathered, voices relaxed. Tension released now that the burden of choice had been lifted. People spoke more freely, as if something heavy had been set down. I remained still for a moment longer than necessary, watching them disperse. The warning was still there, intact, unchanged. But it was no longer waiting for expression. It had been confined to memory, sealed off by my own restraint. I understood then that silence was not just something that happened. It was something I had done. And in doing it, I had made the decision irreversible. Not because events could not change, but because I had crossed into a place where speaking later would no longer be warning. It would be confession. So I said nothing. I moved when I was supposed to move. I followed when I was supposed to follow. I carried the weight quietly, letting it press inward instead of outward. And as the door closed behind the decision, I felt the silence lock into place. Final, complete, and entirely mine. The first signs did not arrive as disaster. They never do. They came as small delays. Adjustments explained as temporary. Messages that arrived later than expected, carrying just enough reassurance to quiet the unease they stirred. The kind of changes that can be absorbed without alarm. especially by people who need to believe that nothing fundamental has gone wrong. I recognized them immediately, not because they were dramatic, but because they matched the shape of my. There is a particular feeling when something you have imagined in private begins to take form in the world. It is not shock, it is confirmation, a tightening in the chest that feels almost calm, because the uncertainty has finally resolved into truth. This is how it starts, I thought. But I did not say it. The days moved forward, carrying the decision with them like a weight that grew heavier the farther it traveled. What had once been discussed in controlled rooms now expressed itself in fragments. Reports stripped of confidence, numbers that needed explanation, phrases that softened expectations without admitting why. Language changed before anyone acknowledged that reality had. Words like unexpected, complicated, and unfortunate began to appear where certainty had once lived. They were spoken carefully, as if choosing the wrong one might give something away, as if naming the problem too clearly would make it real. I listened. That was my role now. I listened as people worked harder to maintain the tone they had committed to. I listened as reassurance was repeated more often, as if frequency could replace accuracy. I listened as responsibility diffused upward and outward, becoming abstract, impossible to locate. No one said, "This was a mistake," not yet. Instead, there was a collective effort to manage perception, to frame what was happening as deviation rather than consequence. Adjustments were made, new assumptions layered over old ones. Each correction carried the quiet hope that the structure could still be stabilized without dismantling what had already been built. I felt a sick familiarity in all of it, because I had imagined this exact phase. Not the specifics, but the rhythm. The way denial doesn't shatter, it stretches. The way people cling to initial certainty even as evidence erodes it, because abandoning it would mean admitting vulnerability in a place that cannot tolerate it. And beneath every explanation, the same flaw remained, unaddressed. I began to notice the toll not in statistics, but in people, in the way shoulders slumped when certain updates were delivered, in the silence that followed questions that could no longer be answered cleanly, in the way men stopped making eye contact when discussing progress, as if ashamed of the words leaving their mouths. The room felt different, heavier, not because of what was said, but because of what could no longer be said honestly. There were moments when I thought someone else might speak up now, retroactively, naming the problem at last. But by then, it was no longer a warning. It was an accusation waiting to be deflected, and no one wanted to be the first to redirect attention backward. Forward motion, even toward failure, was safer. I caught myself watching faces more closely than maps or papers. I studied the way expressions tightened when certain outcomes were mentioned, the way voices dropped when discussing consequences that could no longer be framed as theoretical. I could see recognition flicker in others, the same way it had once flickered in me. Everyone knew, but knowing had become dangerous. Because now there was something at stake beyond prevention: accountability. And accountability has a way of scattering itself when too many hands have touched the same decision. As the situation worsened, the language shifted again. What had been unexpected became inevitable. What had been complicated became unavoidable. The narrative hardened around the idea that no alternative had ever truly existed. I felt something inside me recoil at that, because I knew it wasn't true. Not because the outcome could have been guaranteed otherwise, but because the conversation that might have changed its shape had never been allowed to happen, and I had helped prevent it. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They accumulated, quietly, in ways that allowed people to remain functional, even as the cost mounted. That too was part of the cruelty. There were losses that could not be explained away, no matter how carefully words were chosen. There were names spoken less often, spaces left empty without ceremony, details omitted not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. I learned then that regret does not always announce itself as grief. Sometimes it arrives as routine, as the ability to continue doing your job while carrying the unspoken knowledge that something you could have interrupted has now become permanent, that your silence has moved from possibility into history. I began to feel it in my body, a tightness that never fully released, a sense of pressure behind my eyes when certain updates were delivered, a heaviness in my limbs when I realized, again, that this was no longer about prevention. It was about aftermath. There were moments when I wanted to say something now, not to stop what was happening, but to acknowledge it, to name the flaw finally, and let it exist in the open. But even that felt impossible, because speaking now would not be seen as courage. It would be seen as distance, as someone trying to separate himself from a shared failure after benefiting from its early certainty. And I knew, with a clarity that hurt, that they would not be wrong. So, I stayed silent. I absorbed the consequences the way I had absorbed the warning, internally, quietly, without disrupting the structure that demanded continuity above all else. The cost unfolded in increments small enough to endure individually, but devastating in total. And with each passing day, the space between what I had known and what I had allowed to happen widened, becoming a gap I could no longer pretend was accidental. The flaw had matured. The outcome was no longer forming. It was here, and I was still saying nothing. Time does not soften silence, it stretches it. Years later, I can still feel the exact weight of those moments, not as memories arranged in order, but as sensations that return without warning. A tightening in the chest when a room grows too confident. A brief surge of heat when someone dismisses a concern with practiced certainty. The instinctive urge to look away when recognition flickers across another face. The war moved on, as wars do. The structure changed shape. New routines replaced old ones. New language covered the scars left by previous decisions. People aged. Some disappeared from the rooms where voices mattered. Others carried on as if continuity itself were proof that everything had been necessary. I carried on too. From the outside, there was nothing to mark me as different. No record of objection. No trace of dissent. No evidence that I had ever stood at the edge of saying something that might have altered the shape of what followed. That is the quiet advantage of silence. It leaves no fingerprints. But inside, nothing resolved. The warning never faded. It did not blur or weaken with time. It remained intact, preserved by the very fact that it had never been spoken. Unchallenged by rebuttal. Untested by outcome. Perfect in its uselessness. I sometimes wonder if speaking would have made it smaller, if hearing it dismissed would have allowed it to die naturally, like so many other thoughts that prove themselves wrong once exposed to air. Instead, it stayed sealed, growing heavier with every passing year, every confirmation that followed the path I had feared. Memory does not replay events faithfully. It edits. It sharpens certain edges and erases others. But the moment I stayed silent has never dulled. It returns with the same clarity every time, the posture of the room, the forward motion, the exact physical act of closing my mouth. I remember how ordinary it felt. That may be the hardest part. There was no drama to mark the choice, no internal declaration, no moment where I told myself, this is wrong, and I will live with it. It happened quietly, efficiently, like any other act of compliance, which means I cannot separate it from myself. I cannot tell the story as one mistake among many. I cannot frame it as a lapse under pressure. It was a clean decision, made without coercion, supported by reasoning I understood perfectly at the time. I chose not to speak because I wanted to remain where I was, because I feared the cost, because silence promised safety, and it delivered. Externally, internally, it did something else. It taught me how easy it is to live alongside knowledge without acting on it, how quickly the mind learns to build rooms around uncomfortable truths and keep them locked, how responsibility can be avoided not by denying awareness, but by refusing expression. I see that pattern everywhere, not just in war, not just in hierarchy, in any place where certainty is valued more than honesty, where momentum is mistaken for inevitability, where speaking late is treated as betrayal instead of warning. I do not judge those who stayed silent with. I understand them too well. Understanding does not absolve. The cost of silence is not always paid immediately. Sometimes it waits. It embeds itself in the way you listen, the way you hesitate, the way you measure your words, long after the danger has passed. It shapes the kind of person you are: careful, controlled, alert to consequences that others dismiss. I am often described as thoughtful, measured, someone who chooses his words carefully. They mean it as praise. They do not know what trained that restraint. There are nights when the memory surfaces without context. No images, no sounds. Just the knowledge that there was a moment when intervention was possible, and I did not take it. On those nights, I do not replay alternative outcomes. I do not imagine heroism. I do not tell myself that everything would have been different. That would be another lie. What stays with me is simpler. I knew. I knew before it happened. I knew while it was being decided. I knew when the consequences began to unfold, and knowing was not enough. The silence did not end when the moment passed. It followed me. It settled into my habits, my instincts, my sense of what is safe to say and what is better left unvoiced. I learned that lesson well, too well, because even now, when the stakes are lower, when the rooms are quieter, when the cost of speaking is no longer measured in lives or outcomes that cannot be reversed, I still feel the old hesitation rise. The breath held, the words paused behind my teeth, and I recognize it for what it is. Not fear exactly, not obedience, not even guilt alone. It is the residue of a choice that cannot be undone, a silence that proved permanent, Everyone knew. No one spoke, and long after the war ended, the quiet remained.